makes perfect sense. Unfortunately, it's been perceived by the general public as nothing but kind of a self-serving sales pitch by the realtor community. Everybody knows that now is a great time to buy. The problem is, the general public remains unconvinced that now is a great time to own because of what they've seen of continuing falling housing values and what they've seen as the alternative attractiveness of renting something versus owning. So no message, no matter how well it's crafted, can compete with the sense that buyers have a fear of loss, and they also have the belief that if they just wait another 6 months, another 3 months, whatever, that they're going to get a better deal around the corner. But I believe we've reached a tipping point where we're going to see in the second half of this year, as we continue to move forward, some real compelling data that suggests that now is the time to buy, and people will want to own more real estate again. First, the conversation's going to change when it comes to units. Now, it's a rather confusing graph, but what I'm showing here is sales each month, year over year in that month for the last 5 years. We knew coming into this year that we'd be challenged. We all knew that because we'd be competing against the tax credits that we had. There are a few markets around the country that have performed better in terms of unit sales than last year, but they're very few. For the majority of us, what we've seen in all the headlines has been sales are down 10, even 15% versus where they were last year. So we could talk all we want about how great a market it is. What reasonable consumer would see headlines like that and think now's a great time to buy? They simply didn't have the confidence. But as we're now seeing in open business trends, and many of you have seen it here, no doubt, is that now that what we're seeing is we're going to the inverse of this as we move through the second half of the year, because we know what happened in the middle of last year. Once the tax credits were over, sales fell off a cliff. So what we're going to see as we move through the second half of the year here, our headlines change. So we're going to be reporting 10 and even 15% greater sales in these individual months than what we had during the period last year. Now the media is going to be able to easily explain it. It's all because of the tax credits. But you know what? It doesn't matter. Consumers will see those increases year over year as a boost and a sign that housing is finally recovering. If you look at home ownership rates, they have dropped from what could be considered an artificial high of about 70% in 2005 to where they are now at about 66%. Overall, unit sales have dropped 32% from their peak at 7.2 million in 2005. Everybody now is kind of trying to ask the question, what's the new norm? Where should we be? We know it's not 7.2 million. It's going to take us a while to get back to that level, but we certainly don't believe it should be the 4.9 or 5 million that we've been experiencing most recently. I don't know the answer more than anyone else, but one of the pieces of information I keep in the back of my mind is the fact that if you look again at history, what you're going to find ever since the Great Depression is that about 5% of American households transact real estate each and every year. During periods of recession, that drops to 4%. That 1% alone represents over 1 million sales that we are convinced is a pent-up demand that simply is waiting for a little more power behind the economy and an increase in confidence before it acts. And if that happens, then that's going to put us in the 6 million range, which is probably where we should be today based on those historical standards. Now, even if homeownership rates remain the same, they don't actually increase. According to the Harvard Joint Study on Housing, they suggest that there will be another 8.2 million additional homeowners above and beyond what is currently in place on an annual basis that will happen between now and 2020. And certainly the concept of household formation, that pent-up demand, is supported by the stats. This is another chart that I find interesting. If you look at it, again, historically, you're going to find that the United States produced roughly 1.3 million households on an annual basis. This is what we're used to. But in 2009, the most recent census numbers, it dropped all the way down to 400,000. And what that is obviously pent-up demand. These are the kids that are now returning and living in the garages and raiding the refrigerator once again. Does that sound familiar to anybody in this room? You don't need to raise your hands if you don't want to. But I can tell you that if you look at some of the numbers, they're really startling. There was another report that just came out recently that said that 45% of males between the ages of 20 to 24 and 18% of males between 25 and 29 are now living at home. These are people who would normally have been perhaps early home buyers. Now, just so you know, I said males. Did anybody hear that? Yes. Just so you know, for the ladies in the room, I can tell you the figures for you are far lower, which simply means you must have your act together more than the males. What do you think? Now, all of what I mentioned here really speaks to the fact that the conversation is going to change when it comes to units. But I also think the conversation is going to change in the coming months when it comes to prices as well. And this will prove the greatest driver of activity in the market. For those of you with extensive careers in the room, this isn't your first rodeo. You've been through this before. You've been through housing cycles. You know this is just an ordinary part of our business and you have to deal with it and plan for it. But what was particularly unique about what we've experienced in the last few years is it was the first time since the Great Depression that we not only had a unit correction, we had a price correction as well. But as bad as it was for those people who have purchased just during the last few years, you have to look at the fact that real estate has historically performed quite well. And even if you look at some of the figures here, and I know unfortunately you can't read it, compound annual growth rate since January 1991, if you purchased at that point, has been at 3%. Compound annual growth rate since January 2000 has been 2.5%. Now, perhaps it's not the rate of appreciation and performance that we'd all like to see, but I can tell you if you invested your money in the stock market in 2000, you haven't gotten a 2.5% annual return. So as far as an asset class is concerned, it actually has performed okay. Overall prices during the last 12 months continued to slide on a national level according to the Federal Home Finance Agency. But we all know that it was a very different story depending on where you were in the country. The states with considerable overbuilding continue to suffer in terms of new construction, but there were many other areas of the country that not only had prices that began to stabilize, but even some areas of the country that began to see organic growth and appreciation rates again. And again, this is why it is so important that we stop